The notification appeared on Detective Matt Denninger's computer screen at exactly 3:12 p.m. on a gray December afternoon in 2018. After 23 years working cold cases for the Cedar Rapids Police Department, he had developed an instinct for recognizing important moments before his conscious mind fully understood their meaning. The GEDmatch genealogical database alert had been waiting in his inbox for less than 4 minutes. But something about the case number made his hand pause over the mouse. Michelle Marie. Last seen December 19, 1979. File last updated 2006. Denninger leaned back in his chair. The fluorescent lights of the department's third-floor investigative unit cast harsh shadows across the stack of manila folders that always covered his workspace. 39 years. He had worked cases going back decades, but nothing reached this far back in time. In 1979, DNA forensic analysis existed only in theoretical papers published by molecular biologists whose work seemed disconnected from real law enforcement. The double helix structure had been understood for decades, but the idea that tiny genetic material could identify a killer belonged firmly in the world of science fiction. Yet here, glowing on his monitor, was undeniable scientific proof that Jerry Lynn Burns' DNA matched biological evidence recovered from an 18-year-old woman's body in the parking lot of Westdale Mall 39 years earlier. The match itself went against every assumption Denninger had carried about the limits of forensic science looking backward. Burns had submitted his DNA to a public genealogy website looking for information about his family ancestry, never imagining that his genetic code would connect him to a brutal crime committed when Jimmy Carter was president. The evidence had been preserved through a combination of careful original investigation and lucky circumstance. Blood samples collected from Michelle Martinko's clothing in December 1979 had been stored in the Cedar Rapids Police Department's evidence facility, surviving multiple moves and administrative changes that had destroyed countless other case materials. The samples had been digitized and reanalyzed only in 2017 as part of a grant-funded project that applied cutting-edge extraction techniques to decades-old biological evidence, recovering genetic profiles from degraded samples that previous technology would have considered useless. Denninger pulled up Michelle Martinko's case file, watching the digitized photographs load on his screen with the slow pace of an overworked SERVER processing high-resolution images. A young face appeared from the pixels, a senior portrait taken in autumn 1979, 3 months before her death. Michelle had been 18 years old, a senior at Kennedy High School, member of the choir. Daughter of Janet and Albert Martinko, she had been killed in the front seat of her family's Buick Electra while Christmas shopping on a Thursday evening, stabbed 29 times in a burst of violence that had shocked Cedar Rapids' sense of itself as a safe Midwestern community. If you're following this investigation and want to understand how genetic genealogy is solving cases that seemed permanently unsolvable, consider staying with this story to see how science is finally delivering justice that seemed impossible just a decade ago. The original investigation file contained over 600 pages of documentation, representing thousands of investigative hours by detectives who had pursued every available lead with the tools accessible in 1979. No security camera footage existed. The technology wasn't yet standard in retail environments. No cell phone records could be traced. Mobile phones remained expensive novelties used mainly by business executives. No DNA analysis could be performed. The forensic application of genetic science was still years away from practical use. The investigation had relied entirely on physical evidence, witness testimony, and traditional detective work. Denninger found himself studying the evidence inventory list typed on an IBM Selectric typewriter with its distinctive font. Each item was cataloged with careful precision. Item 14, female winter coat, red, significant blood staining on right sleeve and front panel. Item 15, blood samples collected from vehicle interior, steering wheel, dashboard, and driver's seat. Item 16, fingernail scrapings collected during autopsy examination, possible foreign tissue present. What struck Denninger was the foresight embedded in that decades-old evidence collection. The original investigators couldn't have known they were preserving genetic material that would remain unreadable for another 15 years. Those blood samples contained molecular signatures that would become the foundation of Michelle's justice. but only after technologies emerged that transformed forensic science from an art into a molecular precision instrument. Michelle Martinko woke on Thursday morning, December 19, 1979. To the sound of her clock radio playing Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run. The Iowa winter had arrived early that year, and frost created intricate patterns across her bedroom window, bending the pale morning sunlight into rainbow fragments that danced across her walls. The two-story colonial house on 8th Avenue Northeast sat in one of Cedar Rapids' established neighborhoods, where families had put down roots and watched their children grow through the decades of post-war prosperity. The day held particular significance for Michelle. School was releasing early for winter break, and she had made plans to complete her Christmas shopping at Westdale Mall that evening. Her mother Janet had prepared French toast for breakfast, a Thursday tradition that had continued since Michelle entered high school. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and butter as Michelle came down the stairs, her blonde hair still damp from the shower, wearing the red winter coat that would later become central. Evidence in the investigation into her death, Michelle's personality, emerged through the small details that her family would later reconstruct for investigators. She was careful about planning, keeping a detailed agenda book where she listed her obligations and appointments in neat handwriting. That morning's entry read, "School early release, 2:15 p.m., mall shopping evening. Call Becky about Friday." She was saving money from her part-time job at JCPenney to buy Christmas presents for her parents and younger sister, refusing to accept money from her father despite his offers to help. The relationship between Michelle and her parents reflected the stable, loving dynamics of a family that had built its life around predictable routines and shared values. Albert Martinko worked as an electrical engineer at Rockwell Collins, the aerospace and defense company that anchored Cedar Rapids' economy. Janet volunteered at their Lutheran church and served on the Kennedy High School Parent Committee. They had raised their daughters with an expectation of trust, allowing Michelle the independence to drive herself to evening activities without the hovering supervision that would become common in later generations. Kennedy High School released its students at 2:15 that afternoon, and Michelle had made plans to drive directly to Westdale Mall before the evening shopping rush intensified. She owned a 1977 Mazda GLC, but that day she had borrowed her family's 1972 Buick Electra. A decision made purely for practical reasons. The Buick's larger trunk could hold the wrapped presents she planned to purchase. The seemingly unimportant choice would later prove crucial to the investigation, as the Buick's distinctive size and color made it more memorable to potential witnesses. Westdale Mall represented the commercial heart of suburban Cedar Rapids in 1979, a sprawling single-story complex anchored by JCPenney and Younkers department stores, surrounded by smaller specialty retailers and a food court that served as a gathering place for teenagers. During winter months, when outdoor activities became impractical, the parking lot stretched across several acres, divided into sections designated by colored signs blue, green, red, yellow, that helped shoppers remember where they had left their vehicles. Michelle arrived at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon, parking the Buick in the mall's northwest section near the JCPenney entrance, where she worked part-time. Witnesses later reported seeing her enter the store where she browsed the women's clothing department before moving to the music section. She purchased an album Supertramp's Breakfast in America, paying with cash and carrying it in a JCPenney bag as she left the store. Around 7:30 p.m., the timeline of Michelle's final hour alive would become one of the most closely examined sequences in Cedar Rapids' criminal history. She was seen leaving JCPenney at 7:32, verified by the timestamp on her purchase receipt. The mall's closing time was 9 p.m. But many stores began shutting down their registers by 8:30, encouraging final purchases. Michelle had apparently completed her shopping earlier than planned, perhaps discouraged by the crowds or unable to find the specific item she sought. What happened during the next 30 to 45 minutes remained hidden from investigators for nearly 4 decades. Michelle never returned home that evening. When she failed to appear by 10 p.m., Janet Martinko called several of Michelle's friends, reaching increasingly frantic conclusions, as each call confirmed that no one had seen or heard from her daughter since. School dismissed that afternoon. Albert Martinko drove to Westdale Mall at 10:40 p.m., searching the parking lot for the distinctive cream-colored Buick. The lot had largely emptied by then, making the Buick immediately visible in the northwest section, where Michelle had parked it nearly 6 hours earlier. Albert approached the vehicle with growing dread, noticing that the driver's side door stood slightly ajar despite the December cold that had settled over Cedar Rapids with the sunset. The interior dome light illuminated a scene that would permanently scar his memory. Michelle lay collapsed across the front bench seat, her red winter coat soaked with blood, her blonde hair matted with the dark evidence of terrible trauma. The violence had been extreme and personal, 29 stab wounds covering her chest, face, and defensive wounds on her hands and arms, where she had tried to protect herself from an attacker whose rage seemed endless. Cedar Rapids police arrived within 8 minutes of Albert Martinko's emergency call. The first responding officers, Patrolman James Doster and William Chen, secured the scene immediately, recognizing that the violence suggested something beyond a simple robbery gone wrong. Michelle's purse remained in the vehicle, her wallet containing $47 in cash untouched. The JCPenney shopping bag sat on the passenger seat, the Supertramp album still sealed in its plastic wrapper. This was not a crime motivated by money. The stabbing represented something far more disturbing, a targeted, personal attack characterized by excessive force that spoke to rage rather than rational criminal purpose. The crime scene processing began immediately despite the December cold and the late hour. Detective Lyle Lenth, a veteran investigator with the Cedar Rapids Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division, arrived at 11:20 p.m. and took command of the investigation. Lenth understood instinctively that the first hours of a homicide investigation often determined whether it would be solved. He ordered comprehensive documentation of everything visible in and around the Buick, including items that might seem irrelevant to less experienced investigators. The blood evidence proved both plentiful and critically important. The attacker had clearly been injured during the struggle. Michelle's fingernails contained tissue and blood that forensic technicians carefully collected, understanding that foreign biological material might eventually prove useful, even though the technology to analyze it properly didn't yet exist. Blood spatter patterns on the dashboard and steering wheel suggested a sustained violent encounter rather than a brief surprise attack. Michelle had fought for her life with desperate determination, leaving evidence of her struggle embedded in the physical traces that would wait nearly for decades for science to decode their meaning. Investigation that followed consumed the Cedar Rapids Police Department for months, eventually expanding to include the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The randomness of the attack, a young woman killed in a mall parking lot, without apparent motive, either a stranger assault or a perpetrator skilled at hiding prior connections to the victim. Investigators interviewed hundreds of individuals, pursuing every fragment of information that might illuminate Michelle's final moments. Yet, despite the intensity and thoroughness of the original investigation, no arrest was ever made. The case gradually transitioned from active to cold. Joining the roster of unsolved homicides that haunted every police department, Michelle Martinko's murder became a permanent wound in Cedar Rapids' collective memory. A reminder that even in safe Midwestern communities, unexplainable evil could strike without warning or apparent reason. Chapter 2. The Vigil Without End. Martinko's transformation began with gestures that seemed entirely reasonable to a grieving mother. She kept Michelle's bedroom exactly as it had been on December 19, 1979, making the bed each morning with the same yellow and white gingham bedspread, dusting the collection of porcelain figurines arranged on the dresser, and ensuring that Michelle's Kennedy High School textbooks remained stacked beside her desk where she had left them the morning she died. The Christmas presents Michelle had been shopping for that final evening were never opened. Janet wrapped them herself from the receipts found in Michelle's purse and placed them under the family tree each December, creating an annual ritual that transformed holiday celebrations into ceremonies of absence. In those first months after the murder, this preservation felt like an act of maternal devotion rather than the beginning of something unhealthy. Janet told herself that maintaining Michelle's space honored her daughter's memory, that keeping the room ready meant acknowledging Michelle's permanent place in their family's story. But as 1980 became 1981 and then 1982, the unchanged bedroom evolved from memorial into something more troubling, a three-dimensional photograph that refused to acknowledge the forward motion of time. Albert Martinko began sleeping in the guest room during the second year after Michelle's death, unable to pass his daughter's doorway each night and see his wife sitting on the edge of the bed, holding Michelle's choir robe and conducting whispered conversations with a daughter who would never answer. The distance between Janet and Albert grew not from lack of love, but from incompatible grieving styles. Albert tried to move forward, returning to his engineering work at Rockwell Collins and forcing himself to engage with the routines of daily survival. Janet interpreted his resilience as betrayal, as though accepting that life continued somehow diminished. Michelle's significance, the annual pilgrimage to the Cedar Rapids Police Department, became Janet's most sacred obligation. Every December 19th, she would dress in her best outfit, drive to the department's downtown headquarters, and request a meeting with whoever was currently assigned to Michelle's case. The ritual persisted across multiple detective reassignments and departmental reorganizations, a constant presence that no one quite knew how to refuse or redirect. Detective Lyle Lenth, who had worked the original investigation, received these visits with patient compassion during his final years before retirement. Later, detectives inherited the tradition with less context and growing discomfort. Janet's reports to police grew increasingly elaborate and increasingly detached from investigative reality. By 1985, she had developed complex theories about Michelle's murder that she constructed through obsessive correspondence with families of other murdered young women across the Midwest. She became convinced that a network of killers was operating along Interstate 380, systematically targeting blonde teenage girls in mall parking lots across Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Her letters to the FBI grew more frequent and more insistent, filled with connections she had drawn between Michelle's case and missing person reports that shared only superficial similarities: young victims, blonde hair, winter months. The evidence for these theories existed only in Janet's mind. Yet she pursued them with the intensity of someone who had found undeniable truth. She covered the walls of Michelle's bedroom with maps, marked by colored pins, indicating where other girls had disappeared, timelines written in increasingly erratic handwriting, and photographs of men who had been arrested for similar crimes in neighboring states. The room that had begun as a memorial transformed into an investigative command center that would have seemed elaborate if it weren't so clearly disconnected from the actual evidence in Michelle's case. What no one recognized during those years, not Albert, not the detectives who received her visits, not the concerned friends from church who gradually stopped including her in social gatherings, was that buried within Janet's obsessive documentation was occasional genuine insight. Her correspondence with other victims' families had created an informal network of shared information that revealed patterns no single jurisdiction had been equipped to recognize. She noticed that several unsolved murders in eastern Iowa during the late 1970s and early 1980s shared characteristics that suggested possible connections that would have been valuable if they hadn't been buried within the larger mass of unfounded speculation. Response to Janet's grief followed predictable patterns. Initial sympathy and support gradually gave way to uncomfortable distance. The women's auxiliary at their Lutheran church stopped inviting Janet to volunteer functions after she used a Christmas bazaar planning meeting to distribute flyers about Michelle's unsolved murder. Neighbors continued polite greetings but avoided extended conversations that might trigger Janet's need to discuss theories about her daughter's killer. The social isolation that surrounded the family wasn't born from cruelty, but from the community's inability to know how to engage with grief that refused to soften or accommodate normal interaction. Albert Martinko died of a massive heart attack on March 8, 1993. Found by a coworker in his office at Rockwell Collins during the lunch hour, he was 61 years old. The official cause was heart disease, but everyone who knew the family understood the actual cause. Albert had been dying slowly for 13 years. Worn down by the combination of unresolved grief over Michelle's murder and the daily experience of watching his wife disappear into an obsession that left no room for the living. Janet discovered the news when two Rockwell Collins managers arrived at her door and met their presence communicating tragedy before they spoke a word. Michelle's younger sister, Angela, had been 12 years old when her sister was murdered, young enough that her memories of Michelle were filtered through the distorting lens of childhood perspective. By 1993, Angela was 26, married, living in Iowa City, and maintaining careful emotional distance from her mother's all-consuming focus on the past. She loved Janet, but had learned that every visit, every phone call, every interaction would eventually circle back to Michelle's murder and the theories that Janet continued to develop with undiminished intensity. Angela returned to Cedar Rapids for her father's funeral and faced the overwhelming task of trying to support a mother whose grip on shared reality had become increasingly shaky. The funeral service at their Lutheran church drew a substantial crowd. Albert's colleagues from Rockwell Collins, neighbors from 8th Avenue Northeast, distant relatives who had maintained sporadic contact over the decades. Pastor David Sorensen delivered a eulogy that carefully acknowledged Albert's professional accomplishments and his devotion to family while avoiding any direct reference to the tragedy that had defined the final years of his life. The reception, following the burial, revealed the extent of Janet's isolation. She stood in the church fellowship hall, surrounded by people who had known her for decades, yet she seemed unable to engage in the normal rituals of grief consolation. Every condolence offered about Albert's death became a prompt for Janet to discuss Michelle's unsolved case, creating awkward interactions that left well-meaning attendees uncertain how to respond. Angela watched her mother transform the reception for her father into an impromptu presentation about theories she had developed, using Albert's death as evidence that the failure to solve Michelle's murder had claimed another victim after the funeral. Angela spent 3 days helping her mother sort through Albert's belongings, a process that revealed the careful compartmentalization he had maintained during his final years. His clothes, his engineering reference books, his modest collection of woodworking tools, all reflected the life of a man who had tried to maintain normalcy within a household dominated by unresolved trauma. Angela discovered letters that Albert had written but never sent, addressed to Michelle, expressing thoughts and feelings that he had been unable to share with his living family members. The letters contained no dramatic revelations, just a father's quiet grief and his struggle to understand how to honor a murdered daughter. While still participating in the world of the living, Janet Martinko continued her solitary vigil through the 1990s and into the 2000s, outliving her husband by 18 years. Her annual visits to the Cedar Rapids Police Department persisted, even as the detectives assigned to Michelle's case changed with increasing frequency. The case file grew thicker, not with new evidence but with Janet's documented theories, letters from other victims' families, and the careful notes that successive investigators made about a mother who refused to accept that some questions might never be answered. The breakthrough in Janet's accumulated materials came not during her lifetime but after. She died on November 3, 2011. At the age of 79 from complications of congestive heart failure, Angela, now 44 and raising 2 teenage children of her own, inherited the family home on 8th Avenue Northeast and faced the monumental task of sorting through 32 years of obsessive documentation. Michelle's bedroom had become a museum of frustrated investigation boxers filled with police reports, newspaper clippings, correspondence with families across the Midwest, and the elaborate maps and timelines that Janet had maintained with deteriorating coherence. Angela approached the task systematically, understanding that simply discarding her mother's life work would feel like a final betrayal of Michelle's memory. She began scanning documents, organizing materials into digital files, and creating databases that would allow her to search for patterns and connections that had been invisible when scattered across physical storage. The process took nearly 2 years of weekend work, slowly converting cardboard boxes and manila folders into searchable digital archives. What Angela discovered within that massive collection surprised her. Buried among the unfounded theories and desperate speculation was evidence of genuine investigative insight. Janet's correspondence network had identified legitimate connections between several unsolved cases in eastern Iowa patterns that individual jurisdictions had never recognized because the crimes crossed county and state boundaries. More importantly, Janet had maintained meticulous records of every person who had been questioned during the original investigation into Michelle's murder, creating an informal database of potential suspects that would prove valuable when new forensic techniques emerged. In 2017, Angela contacted the Cedar Rapids Police Department and offered to provide complete digital access to her mother's archived materials. Detective Matt Denninger, who had recently been assigned to review cold cases for possible DNA analysis, recognized immediately that Angela's systematic approach represented something fundamentally different from Janet's desperate obsession, where Janet had been driven by grief and magical thinking. Angela brought methodical organization and emotional stability to the question of Michelle's unsolved murder. Detective Jennifer Rothel discovered the misfiled evidence box on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in July 2006 during a mandatory reorganization of the Cedar Rapids Police Department's property and evidence storage facility. The department had recently moved its evidence archives from the cramped basement of the old municipal building to a climate-controlled warehouse on the city's industrial southwest side, part of a broader modernization effort funded by federal grants, intended to improve evidence preservation and chain-of-custody protocols. The reorganization required every piece of stored evidence to be photographed, reinvented, and transferred to the new facility's computerized tracking system. Rothel, a 12-year veteran who had been assigned to the property unit as a transitional posting before her planned retirement, found herself spending long summer days in the poorly ventilated basement, sorting through decades of accumulated case materials that represented the archaeological layers of Cedar Rapids criminal history. The Martinko evidence box sat wedged behind several containers of traffic accident reconstruction materials from the 1980s, misplaced during some earlier reorganization that no one could now remember or document. The box itself showed signs of environmental stress water staining along the bottom, edges from a pipe leak that had occurred sometime in the 1990s, dust accumulation suggesting years of neglect, and a handwritten label whose ink had faded to barely legible brown script that read, Martinko Homicide 12-79. Rothel lifted the box carefully, noting its unexpected weight. Inside, she found herself looking at evidence from a case that predated her law enforcement career by 7 years. The original inventory sheet, typed on what appeared to be an IBM Selectric typewriter, listed 43 items collected during the investigation into Michelle Martinko's murder. Most were routine materials, photographs of the crime scene, witness statement transcripts, soil samples from the parking lot, fiber evidence that had yielded no useful matches given the forensic limitations of 1979. But certain items made Rothel pause in the stifling basement air. Evidence bag 17 contained Michelle's red winter coat, the fabric stiff with decades-old bloodstains that had oxidized to rust brown but remained clearly visible. Evidence bag 19 held blood samples collected from the Buick's interior, preserved in glass vials that had been sealed with red evidence tape and signed by the collecting technician. The labels indicated that some blood appeared, inconsistent with Michelle's typo-positive samples found on the steering wheel and dashboard when Michelle's blood type was documented as a positive. The foreign blood samples represented the most significant forensic evidence from the original investigation, yet they had yielded no investigative value in 1979. Blood typing could eliminate suspects, but couldn't positively identify individuals with the precision that modern investigations demanded. The samples had been preserved with careful attention to protocol, following FBI guidelines for evidence collection, yet they remained essentially useless until DNA analysis technology emerged during the mid-1980s. Rothel found detailed notes from the original forensic examination, handwritten by crime scene technician Robert Wallace, whose meticulous documentation habits were legendary among longtime Cedar Rapids officers. Wallace had collected blood samples from 17 different locations within the Buick, photographing each collection site and documenting the exact position and appearance of every stain. His notes indicated his suspicion that the O-positive blood came from the perpetrator, likely the result of defensive wounds inflicted by Michelle during her desperate struggle for survival. More significantly, Rothel discovered that fingernail scrapings collected during Michelle's autopsy had been preserved in sealed containers that showed no signs of degradation or contamination. The medical examiner's notes indicated that tissue and blood had been recovered from beneath several of Michelle's fingernails, consistent with her having scratched her attacker during the violent encounter. In 1979, this biological material had been noted but couldn't be analyzed with any useful specificity. By 2006, it represented potential DNA evidence that could identify Michelle's killer with scientific certainty. The realization of what she was holding transformed Rothel's routine inventory task into something far more important. She immediately contacted Detective Matt Denninger, who had recently been assigned to the department's cold case unit with a specific mandate to identify older cases that might benefit from modern forensic analysis. Denninger arrived at the storage facility within 30 minutes. His interest heightened by the fact that Michelle Martinko's murder remained one of Cedar Rapids' most notorious unsolved cases. Denninger carefully examined each evidence item, understanding that the preservation quality would determine whether DNA analysis could succeed. The blood vials had remained sealed since 1979, protected from environmental contamination that could have degraded the genetic material. The fingernail scrapings had been stored in airtight containers at room temperature. Not ideal by contemporary standards, but potentially sufficient for the advanced extraction techniques that had emerged during the previous decade. The evolution of DNA forensic technology had been dramatic since the technique's first criminal application in the mid-1980s. Early DNA analysis required relatively large samples of fresh biological material and could take months to process. By 2006, new methods allowed analysts to extract usable genetic profiles from microscopic samples, degraded evidence, and biological material that had been stored for decades under less than optimal conditions. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations Criminalistics Laboratory had recently acquired equipment capable of analyzing the type of aged samples preserved in Michelle's case. Denninger initiated the formal process of submitting evidence for DNA analysis in August 2006. Understanding that bureaucratic procedures and laboratory backlogs meant that results might take months or even years, the blood samples and fingernail scrapings were transported to the state laboratory in Enkine under strict chain of custody protocols, accompanied by detailed documentation explaining the case, history, and the potential significance of successful DNA recovery. The laboratory analysis consumed nearly 18 months, complicated by the age and condition of the biological samples. The blood vials yielded partial DNA profiles that were sufficient for comparison purposes but not ideal for database searches. The fingernail scrapings proved more productive, containing skin cells that had remained remarkably well preserved despite their age. By March 2008, Laboratory Director Dr. Michael Thompson delivered preliminary results that confirmed what Robert Wallace had suspected in 1979: the foreign blood and tissue samples came from someone other than Michelle Martinko. The DNA profile was entered into the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the national database that compared genetic evidence from crime scenes against profiles of convicted offenders and arrestees. Denninger waited for the notification that would indicate a match. Understanding that CODIS hits had solved numerous cold cases by identifying perpetrators whose DNA had been collected during subsequent arrests for unrelated crimes. Days became weeks, weeks became months, and no match appeared. Whoever had killed Michelle Martinko either had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA collection or had died before the widespread implementation of DNA database requirements. The investigation stalled again, but this time with a crucial difference. The DNA profile existed as a permanent scientific fingerprint, waiting for the technological or investigative breakthrough that would finally attach a name to the genetic code. Denninger kept the case file active, occasionally reviewing the evidence and considering new approaches that might identify Michelle's killer. The profile sat in CODIS, silently comparing itself against every new entry, searching for the match that would deliver justice after nearly 3 decades of waiting. The breakthrough began not in a police laboratory but in the suburban basement of a genetic genealogist named Cease Moore, who had spent the previous decade pioneering techniques that transformed recreational ancestry research into a forensic investigative tool. By 2018, Moore had established herself as the leading expert in applying consumer DNA databases to criminal investigations, using the same genetic comparison methods that helped adoptees find biological parents to instead identify violent offenders who had evaded traditional law enforcement for decades. Detective Matt Denninger contacted Moore in September 2018. After reading about her success solving the Golden State Killer case in California, that investigation had demonstrated that even partial DNA profiles from decades-old evidence could be matched to perpetrators through genealogical database searches, bypassing the limitations of CODIS that required direct matches to individuals already in the criminal justice system. The methodology exploited a simple biological reality. Everyone shares genetic material with relatives, and those relationships leave measurable signatures in DNA that can be traced through family trees. Moore agreed to analyze the DNA profile, extracted from Michelle Martinko's fingernail scrapings. Understanding that the case represented exactly the type of cold investigation where genetic genealogy could deliver results impossible through conventional methods. The process began by uploading the crime scene DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where individuals who had taken commercial ancestry tests through companies like 23andMe and Ancestry could voluntarily share their genetic information to find relatives. The upload produced immediate results, not a direct match to the killer, but connections to dozens of distant cousins whose genetic overlap with the crime scene DNA indicated shared ancestry several generations back. Moore began the painstaking work of constructing family trees for each identified cousin, working backward through birth certificates, marriage records, census data, and obituaries to identify common ancestors who had lived in Iowa during the 19th and early 20th centuries. The genealogical research consumed 6 weeks of intensive work, during which Moore constructed elaborate family trees that eventually converged on a married couple named Peter and Ida Burns, who had homesteaded land in Lynn County during the 1880s. The Burns family had produced numerous descendants who remained in eastern Iowa across multiple generations, creating a genetic web that connected the crime scene DNA to dozens of potential suspects through various family branches. More systematically, eliminated possibilities by analyzing age, gender, and geographic location. The killer had to be male based on Y chromosome markers in the DNA profile. He had to be old enough in December 1979 to have committed the crime, which meant birth dates before approximately 1964. He had to have some connection to Cedar Rapids or the surrounding area to explain his presence at Westdale Mall on the evening Michelle was killed. These filters reduced the suspect pool from dozens to 6 individuals, all descendants of Peter and Ida Burns through different family lines. Denninger received Moore's preliminary report on November 28, 2018, and felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied genuine investigative breakthroughs. The 6 potential suspects ranged in age from 54 to 68, all living within a 100-mile radius of Cedar Rapids. 2 had died in the intervening decades. 3 had criminal records that made them plausible suspects for a violent crime. 1 name appeared. With no obvious red flags, Jerry Lynn Burns, age 64, living in Manchester, Iowa, approximately 40 miles north of Cedar Rapids. The challenge now was obtaining DNA samples from the living suspects to determine which one matched the crime scene profile. Direct requests for voluntary samples risked alerting a guilty suspect and potentially triggering flight or evidence destruction. Denninger needed to collect DNA secretly, using methods that courts had repeatedly affirmed as legal abandoned biological material that individuals had discarded without any expectation of privacy. The surveillance of Jerry Burns began on December 3, 2018. Undercover officers followed Burns through his daily routines in Manchester, a small town of 5,000 residents where Burns owned a farm supply business and had lived for most of his adult life. He appeared to lead an unremarkable existence. Methodist church services, eating lunch at the local Casey's General Store, conducting business transactions with the unhurried pace typical of rural Iowa commerce. The DNA collection opportunity came on December 6th when Burns discarded a drinking straw after finishing a soda at a local restaurant. Officers retrieved the straw from a public trash can and submitted it immediately to the state laboratory for comparison against the Martinko crime scene profile. The analysis required 72 hours of processing time that felt endless to Denninger, who understood that a positive match would solve a case that had haunted Cedar Rapids for 39 years. The laboratory director called Denninger at 2:15 p.m. on December 10, 2018. The DNA from Jerry Burns' discarded straw matched the profile from Michelle Martinko's fingernail scrapings with a statistical certainty of 1 in several trillion. After nearly 4 decades, Michelle's killer had been identified with scientific precision that admitted no reasonable doubt. Denninger spent the following week building a comprehensive background investigation into Jerry Burns before executing an arrest. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had lived an outwardly conventional life, while harboring secrets that no one in Manchester suspected. Burns had been 25 years old in December 1979, living in Cedar Rapids and working in construction. He had no documented connection to Michelle Martinko, no obvious motive, and no prior criminal record that would have made him a suspect in the original investigation. Further research revealed troubling patterns. Burns had been questioned briefly during the initial investigation as part of the broad canvassing of young men who lived or worked in Cedar Rapids, but the interview had been cursory and had never progressed to serious scrutiny. He had moved to Manchester in 1982, marrying and establishing his farm supply business while maintaining complete silence about whatever had happened in the Westdale Mall parking lot 3 years earlier. The arrest came on December 19, 2018, exactly 39 years to the day after Michelle Martinko's murder. Denninger led a team of officers to Burns' farm supply store in Manchester, taking him into custody without incident in front of stunned employees and customers who knew Burns as a quiet, unremarkable businessman. The arrest warrant detailed the DNA evidence with clinical precision, explaining how genetic genealogy had accomplished what 3 decades of traditional investigation could not. Burns' response to interrogation revealed nothing. He invoked his constitutional right to remain silent and refused to provide any statement about Michelle's murder. The DNA evidence made his cooperation unnecessary for prosecution purposes, but his silence denied investigators and Michelle's family any insight into the motivation or circumstances that had led a 25-year-old construction worker to commit such horrific violence against a teenage stranger. The investigation into Jerry Lynn Burns' background accelerated immediately following his arrest, revealing a pattern of deception and violence that had remained hidden beneath the surface of small-town respectability for 4 decades. Detective Matt Denninger assembled a task force that included investigators from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and FBI behavioral analysts who specialized in reconstructing the histories of violent offenders who had successfully evaded detection. For extended periods, Burns' criminal history before Michelle's murder was minimal: a 1977 citation for disorderly conduct and a 1978 arrest for public intoxication, both resolved with minor fines. Nothing in these records suggested capacity for the extreme violence that characterized Michelle Martinko's killing, yet the absence of documented criminal behavior before December 1979 made psychological sense to the FBI analysts. Many violent offenders committed their first serious crimes during their a developmental period when impulse control mechanisms that typically matured during adolescence sometimes failed catastrophically. Task Force discovered that Burns had been living in Cedar Rapids in December 1979, renting a basement apartment on the city's southwest side and working for a residential construction company. His work schedule placed him in the general vicinity of Westdale Mall during the time frame when Michelle was killed. Though nothing in the employment record suggested any specific reason he would have been at the mall that evening. The randomness of the encounter: construction worker and a high school senior with no apparent prior connection fit the profile of an opportunistic predator rather than a planned assassination. More disturbing patterns emerged when investigators examined Burns' movements. During the years immediately following Michelle's murder, he had relocated to Manchester in June 1982, a move that appeared sudden and without obvious economic motivation. His construction employment in Cedar Rapids had been stable and relatively well compensated, yet he had abandoned it to purchase a struggling farm supply business in a town where he had no family connections or established relationships. The relocation suggested someone creating distance from a place that held dangerous associations. Denninger's team interviewed dozens of Manchester residents who had known Burns across the decades, searching for indications of violent tendencies or suspicious behavior that might have gone unreported. The portrait that emerged was unsettling in its ordinariness. Burns had been a quiet, somewhat withdrawn businessman who participated minimally in community affairs, but maintained cordial relationships with customers and neighbors. His marriage had ended in divorce in 1995. Though the separation appeared amicable and involved no documented domestic violence or protective orders, yet buried within these apparently normal life patterns were troubling incidents that had never been reported to law enforcement. 3 women who had worked for Burns at various times during the 1980s and 1990s described uncomfortable interactions, inappropriate comments, invasive questions about their personal lives, and boundary violations that stopped just short of actionable harassment. None had filed formal complaints attributing Burns' behavior to social awkwardness rather than malicious intent. The pattern suggested someone who tested limits and assessed vulnerability while maintaining plausible deniability. The search of Burns' property in Manchester, authorized by warrant on December 20, 2018, yielded evidence that transformed understanding of his decades-long deception. The main residence contained nothing obviously incriminating, but investigators using ground-penetrating radar identified anomalies beneath the concrete floor of a detached garage that Burns had constructed in 1986. Excavation revealed a metal lockbox buried 3 feet below the surface, sealed in plastic and preserved against moisture damage. The lockbox contents documented a secret life that contradicted everything Manchester residents believed about Jerry Burns. Inside were photographs, dozens of images showing young women photographed without their knowledge in public settings. The photos dated from the early 1980s through the mid-1990s, all depicting blonde women between approximately 16 and 25 years old, often captured in parking lots or shopping areas where they appeared unaware of being watched. More significantly, the box contained personal items that appeared to be Trophiza woman's watch, several pieces of inexpensive jewelry, a student identification card from a University of Iowa student who had been reported missing in 1985, and a small ceramic angel figurine. Each item had been carefully preserved in individual plastic bags labeled with dates and cryptic notes that suggested Burns maintained a catalog of encounters or fantasies that had never been reported to authorities. The student identification card led investigators to the case of Rachel Thompson, who had disappeared from Iowa City on March 12, 1985. While walking to her apartment from a late-night study session, Thompson's case had remained unsolved, her body never recovered, her fate unknown. The presence of her ID in Burns' possession suggested involvement in her disappearance, though the absence of DNA evidence or physical remains made prosecution for that crime uncertain. Forensic analysis of the photographs revealed that they had been taken across multiple locations in eastern Iowa: Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, Waterloo. Dubuque suggesting that Burns had maintained his predatory surveillance activities across a wide geographic area during the decade following Michelle's murder. The images themselves weren't illegal, but they documented a pattern of stalking and obsessive focus on young blonde women that provided insight into Burns' psychological profile. The discovery that devastated Denninger came when the task force reconstructed the timeline of the original 1979 investigation into Michelle's murder. Burns had been interviewed on January 8, 1980, as part of the systematic canvassing of young men who lived or worked in Cedar Rapids. The interview had been conducted by a single detective who found nothing suspicious in Burns' account of his activities. On December 19th, Burns claimed he had been home alone that evening watching television, an alibi that was impossible to verify but equally impossible to disprove. The interview notes revealed that the detective had considered Burns an unlikely suspect based purely on demeanor and presentation. Burns had appeared cooperative, had answered questions without evasion, and had voluntarily provided blood samples for type comparison. His blood type O positive had matched the foreign blood found in Michelle's car. But in 1980, that coincidence meant nothing definitive. Approximately 42% of the population shared O-positive blood type, making it insufficient grounds for focused investigation. More tragically, the original investigation had come within days of potentially solving the case through traditional methods. Detective Lyle Lenth had identified Burns as someone warranting additional scrutiny based on the blood type match and his proximity to Westdale Mall. Lenth had planned to conduct follow-up interviews and surveillance, but the investigation had been overwhelmed by hundreds of potential suspects and thousands of investigative leads. Burns had simply disappeared into the mass of possibilities, never receiving the sustained attention that might have identified him as Michelle's killer decades earlier. The trial of Jerry Lynn Burns began on February 10, 2020. In the Lynn County Courthouse, 40 years and 2 months after Michelle Martinko's murder, the delay between arrest and trial had consumed 13 months. During which Burns' defense attorneys had mounted aggressive challenges to the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence that formed the prosecution's foundation. The legal arguments raised novel constitutional questions about privacy, expectations in the era of consumer DNA testing, and whether law enforcement's use of public genealogical databases constituted unlawful search. Judge Hoover ruled that the evidence was admissible, finding that individuals who voluntarily uploaded their genetic information to public databases had no reasonable expectation that the data would remain private from law enforcement scrutiny. The decision aligned with precedents established in other genetic genealogy cases across the country, but it remained legally controversial and would likely be tested through appeals, regardless of the trial's outcome. Led by Linn County Attorney Jerry Vander Sandon, built its case on the undeniable scientific evidence that connected Burns to Michelle's murder. The DNA match carried a statistical probability of 1 in several trillion, a number so astronomically certain that it effectively eliminated any possibility of coincidental genetic overlap. Forensic experts testified about the meticulous chain of custody that had preserved the biological evidence for 4 decades and the advanced extraction techniques that had recovered usable genetic profiles from degraded samples. The emotional centerpiece of the trial came when Angela Martinko Dreyer took the witness stand to speak about her sister's life and the decades of grief that had consumed their family. Angela, now 52 years old, described Michelle as a conscientious student, devoted daughter, and beloved sister whose murder had created a permanent void that could never be filled. She spoke about their mother, Janet's 32-year obsession with solving the case, about their father Albert's death from what she termed accumulated heartbreak, and about the relief of finally knowing the truth after 4 decades of uncertainty. The defense attempted to create reasonable doubt by highlighting the absence of any documented connection between Burns and Michelle. They argued that the chance encounter theory that Burns had randomly selected Michelle as a victim in a mall parking lot seemed implausible given the deliberate nature of the attack. They suggested that the investigation had focused too narrowly on Burns after the DNA match, potentially overlooking alternative explanations for how his genetic material had come to be on Michelle's body. But the prosecution countered with the buried lockbox evidence, presenting the photographs of surveilled women and the personal items that suggested a pattern of predatory behavior extending across years. While Burns could not be charged for crimes related to those materials without additional evidence, their existence painted a portrait of someone whose outward normalcy concealed violent obsessions. The student identification card belonging to Rachel Thompson, the missing University of Iowa student, particularly resonated with jurors who understood its implication even without explicit testimony about Thompson's unsolved disappearance. Burns himself never testified, maintaining the silence he had adopted immediately after his arrest. His attorneys advised against allowing prosecutors the opportunity to cross-examine him, understanding that his inability to explain the DNA evidence would only strengthen the state's case. His demeanor throughout the trial remained expressionless, showing no visible emotional response to testimony about the violence he had inflicted on Michelle or the suffering her family had endured. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on first-degree murder. The speed of deliberation reflected the overwhelming strength of the DNA evidence and the absence of any credible alternative explanation. Judge Hoover sentenced Burns to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder under Iowa law. Burns was 66 years old. He would die in prison. The conviction delivered a form of justice, but it remained fundamentally incomplete. Burns' refusal to explain his actions meant that critical questions would never be answered. Why Michelle? What had triggered the explosive violence that characterized the attack? Had there been other victims beyond Rachel Thompson, whose disappearances remained unsolved? The silence denied closure even as it provided legal resolution. Angela Martinko Dreyer received notification of the verdict by phone, sitting in her Iowa City home surrounded by family members who had accompanied her through the trial. The relief she felt was complex satisfaction that Burns would be held accountable, grief that her parents had died without knowing this outcome, and anger that for decades had been necessary to achieve what DNA technology could now accomplish in months. The formal closure of Michelle's case allowed Angela to finally arrange the memorial service that had been impossible while uncertainty persisted. The service was held at First Presbyterian Church in Cedar Rapids on April 12, 2020. Originally planned as an in-person gathering, but converted to a virtual ceremony due to COVID-19 pandemic restrictions that had emerged during the preceding weeks. The digital format felt oddly appropriator, 21st century memorial for a case that had been solved through cutting-edge technology unavailable when Michelle died. Angela spoke during the service about the importance of persistence and the power of scientific advancement to deliver justice that seemed permanently out of reach. She thanked Detective Matt Denninger, genetic genealogist, CSMOR, and the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation for their work solving Michelle's case. Most importantly, she announced the establishment of the Michelle Marie Martinko Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to funding DNA analysis of cold cases and supporting families navigating the unique grief of unsolved violent crimes. The foundation would use proceeds from a victim compensation settlement and private donations to provide grants for genetic genealogy analysis in cases where traditional investigation had reached dead ends. Angela understood that she couldn't resurrect her sister or restore the years her parents had lost to grief. But she could ensure that Michelle's death contributed to solving other families' anguished mysteries and preventing the prolonged suffering that had defined the Martinko family's existence. The small ceramic angel figurine recovered from Burns' buried lockbox was returned to Angela after being processed as evidence. The item had never been definitively connected to any specific victim, but Angela suspected it might have belonged to Michelle, perhaps taken from her purse or person during the attack. She placed it on a shelf in her home office, where she managed the foundation's operations, a tangible reminder of why the work mattered. Detective Denninger retired from the Cedar Rapids Police Department in December 2020, concluding a 30-year career that had culminated in solving the case that had haunted the department since before he joined the force. He remained involved with the Martinko Foundation as an advisor, helping to evaluate cold cases that might benefit from genetic genealogy analysis and serving as a bridge between grieving families and the complex forensic science that could potentially deliver answers. On December 19, 2021, 42 years after Michelle's murder, Angela visited the Martinko family plot in Cedar Memorial Cemetery, where Michelle's memorial marker stood beside the graves of Janet and Albert. The marker, installed after the trial, carried Michelle's name, her dates of birth and death, and a simple inscription, "Beloved daughter and sister, forever 18. Justice delayed but not denied." Angela stood in the winter cold, remembering the sister she had known only briefly and the parents whose lives had been consumed by unanswered questions. The grief would always remain, but it had been transformed by knowledge. Michelle could finally rest. The family's long vigil was over. The truth had taken 4 decades to emerge, had required technologies that didn't exist when Michelle died, had depended on the persistent obsession of a grieving mother and the systematic organization of a surviving sister. But it had emerged. Jerry Burns would spend his remaining years in prison, and Michelle Martinko's name would be remembered not as an unsolved mystery, but as a solved case that demonstrated the power of scientific advancement to deliver justice across the vast distances of time.